Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Jacob Kovalio. He is a professor at Carleton University, professor, Department of History. We're having an ongoing conversation about China and the world, which includes conversations about Canada, of course, but also Japan and some of the immediate issues and longer-term issues that are affecting Western countries. Dr. Kovalio, thanks for joining us for this extended broadcast.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine, really. In principle, not only in principle, but in reality, what your show and the News Forum are doing is a phenomenally crucial job in serving the role of some kind of an island of sanity, balance, and truth in an environment that's many times gives me the impression that we are in a sinisterist situation. Sinisterism is a word I coined from the Latin sinister for left. So going back to the strategic or international situation, there's just this very interesting and annual, extremely important conference in Halifax, the annual security conference with participants, including the U.S. Defense Secretary, Mr. Austin, and the Chinese Defense Minister, Wei Fenghe. These platforms are very important for engaging in communication with the other side, not with harboring any kind of illusions as to the very deep divide that exists between the democracies and the totalitarian entities, headed, of course, first and foremost, and more than any other, by China. So while being in contact, exchanging views, not holding back, by the way, at all, but then at the same time preparing ourselves for worst case scenarios, that is a very important element in my view. Secondly, there is the issue of involvement, very timely in our case, involvement in our domestic politics by elements such as, again, the Chinese regime.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because that is coming to light, these revelations of Chinese Communist Party interference in Canadian elections.
Right.
What's your take on that?
Right. That's the point. We, the democracy, are at an obvious disadvantage when interacting with a regime such as China's or even Russia's, if you will, to which we have absolutely no access in any form, in other words, to express critical opinions of the regime and so on and so forth. The other way is, we are a free and open society, thanks God, but we really have to learn how to deal with the fact that foreign elements, foreign entities that don't exactly support or, which try to take advantage of this phenomenally wonderful freedom that we have for just almost everybody. So what do? Well, we should engage in as much as possible of a reasonable campaign of informing Canadians as to what it is that's happening here specifically. In the last 2 years, there have been not one, not two, but 3 book-length treatments of Chinese espionage in our country and in Australia. I'm talking about Sam Cooper's Willful Blindness, which focuses actually on the so-called COVID-19 crisis that started in 2020, and then Jonathan Manthorpe's book, and in the case of Australia, which is also the receiving end of a lot of Chinese shenanigans, Clive Hamilton. If you can write an entire book, or even more than one, on that kind of an activity, it is up to us not to stop being what we are, God forbid, but to spread the word as to what kind of a reality we're facing and the manner in which we should conduct our relationship with China. United Front Work Department is the kind of arm of the party, everything and anything under the aegis of the Communist Party.
Sure.
Nothing occurs outside of its, completely and dominant position. So they've interfered with the well-being of Canadians of Chinese immediate Chinese ancestry,
We're going to
creating
just take
unpleasant.
another break. Before the break, we were just talking about this idea of political interference, if you will, with our electoral processes. And please continue to make your point.
Yes. There was an article in the media by the Prime Minister and Senator Wu in our Senate, where the main idea was that if we, whoever that is, criticize China, that's going to cause mistreatment or even, God forbid, attacks on people of Chinese ancestry, Chinese descent. That is absolutely preposterous. Simply because we should do both. Tell inform Canadians as to the real situation, the real nature of the Chinese regime, and at the same time deal to the full extent of the law with any individual who would dare to harm any person because of their ancestry, which, by the way, the average Canadian can't distinguish between a Japanese, a Chinese person, a Filipino person, and so on and so forth. But that is just a little detail.
There's also that story about the Chinese Communist Party creating quasi-police stations in Canada. Can you comment on that in your analysis?
Well, that is the Beijing version of Service Canada in our case, supposedly, because what they're saying is that they wanted to make sure that people in the Chinese community, of course, we're talking about recent arrivals, relatively recent arrivals, would be well served as to the situation back home. That is completely unacceptable. It's just it's a subterfuge and absolutely unacceptable. We should not allow that. They've done it in 25 places to the extent, well, according to the latest information that I have. So there is an issue. See, we are lagging behind, for example, in shutting down all the Confucius Institutes on our campuses, including my own.
Yes, and please describe to our audience what those are.
Yes. Well, the Confucius Institutes formally are, when allowed to be established on Western campuses in democracies such as our own, are supposed to inform Canadians, in our case, about China, teach people the language. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, in reality, what they most of the time do is engage in propaganda, direct or indirect, for the regime. That is the unacceptable element, because of which in Europe, in Western Europe, by the way, in Eastern Europe in particular, they have just about been stamped out, and we should do the same thing, or impose, or try, not try, but demand that democracy institutes, for example, Canadian, British, American, be established in China. That's a reciprocity that makes a lot of sense to me. The level of penetration of our political life by the regime is what made me, among other things, to write that particular essay, Dire History Repeated. For example, in Australia, Senator Sam Dastyari was forced to resign when evidence was produced that he was acting in a way that was not exactly serving the best interest of Australia. In our case, I'd like to suggest an article that was published in late October the 30th, 2015, titled, "Now That Harper Is Gone, Can We Have a Serious Talk About China?" It was written by Senator Yuanbao Wu. And I, for one, and this is my responsibility, of course, have come to refer to as the Beijing on the Rideau Manifesto. And, well, there are 5 commandments of sorts that we Canadians, who are supposed to be completely ignorant of China, that we should follow in the manner in which we deal with that counterpart in ways that are a little bit not very conducive to serving our national interests. Let's just leave it at that. People can have, of course, direct access to the piece on their own and make their own judgment. So, yes, we are facing a situation that superficially considered seems to be placing the democracies in a retreating situation, democracy being under
And with
pressure.
that, we're just going to take another brief break, sir.
Yes.
Continue that strain of thought after the break. And we're back here at Boom or Bust with Dr. Jacob Kovalio, Professor, Department of History, Carleton University in Ottawa, continuing to talk about China and its relationship with Canada and the rest of the world. As you continue your conversation, Professor, I'd love to get your sense of what's going on in our Arctic zone with China as well. I think that is of geopolitical interest in addition to our conversation so far.
Yes. Well, generally speaking, I don't think democracies are in some kind of a real crisis. It's just a matter of the ideological realm, if you wish, being dominated by those who have never been very strong supporters of democracy writ large, which we, and of course the other democracies, have been very successful in creating the kind of political and economic environment that attracts just about everybody. In other words, it's not the Chinas of the world, let alone the Russias of the world, and so on and so forth, that can point to a backlog of about 1.6 or 1.5 million people, I'm talking about ourselves, trying to come and become part of this wonderful country. And it is not the Chinas and the Russias and other totalitarian regimes of the world where you have in the last 7 or 8 months, I'm referring to the United States, no less than about 800,000 people have crossed the border from Mexico into the United States. In other words, we should be aware of the fact that when it comes to the most fundamental elements in human life, in politics, most obviously in human rights, we are where it's at. No other entity or cluster of entities in the world comes even close. And for that to be the manner in which we, writ large, consider ourselves and therefore talk about education is absolutely crucial. Education to democracy, the way I call it, which these days is not the case. And of course, that would take another, significant point of or time to dedicate to it. In other words, what I'm trying to say, I think, is that our education system has to undergo a very significant reform in order to allow us to return to our foundations and to really give democracy its due and its respect, which we seem to be sort of going, which we seem to be, not to be doing at this particular point in time, which I think is a mistake. Yes,
Right.
yes. When it comes to, again, going back to China, China is engaging constantly in the kind of propaganda, internal propaganda, the aim of which is to find at any given point in time the same or a new boogeyman in order to divert the attention of the Chinese nation to all kinds of usually completely invented foreign devils of sorts. Example, since 1994, China has had something called anti-Japanese patriotic education. Every year, for example, there are anywhere between 150 or 200 films, full-fledged films, feature films, at the center of which is the idea of complete demonization for Japan, stemming from what Japan did, the way in which it behaved until 1945, which is historically documented, for which Japan has profusely apologized. It has changed drastically, so that the Chinese regime is using that only in order to, again, deflect the attention of the Chinese people from what is happening in the country itself, with the internal surveillance budgets actually being larger than the military and defense budget of China, by the way.
About the Arctic, can you comment on that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
About the incursions by the Chinese on Arctic policy in our far north?
Yes. Well, again, China is pursuing a policy of becoming an involved entity just about everywhere, and the Arctic is only one of the newer directions in which China is going. Incidentally, in indirect cooperation with Russia, and we can expect that to be the case in the future as well.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm here with Dr. Jacob Kovalio. He's a professor at the Department of History, Carleton University in Ottawa. Doctor, please continue your thoughts.
Yes, I'd like, if I may, to just touch on one last but significant point in my view. All of us have been exposed to ideas along the lines of Asia is back. The 21st century is going to be an Asian and most recently a Chinese century. I would like to not humbly suggest that we, the human family, including people like me, have no capacity of forecasting the future. And I'll give two examples that I think are relevant. In 1949, George Orwell published his immortal 1984, with, of course, forecast the future where Stalin-like dictatorship, totalitarianism would be the fate of us, the human family. So it happened that in 1985, just a year after 1984, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, and the rest, they say, history. History, of course, in the positive sense, in that, the most advanced form of Marxism. And Marxism, by the way, as an idea, is a fraud, a lie with regards to egalitarian, Marxism being egalitarian. It never was. It's the least equal system. When in power, Marxism is a crime against humanity of all kinds of levels. Consider Mao the worst, or some benign Marxists like the Castro brothers. And most recently, by the way, in Nicaragua, the Ortega regime, which has become a one-party state. The second example that I'm giving, which unfortunately is not positive, it's a masterpiece, analytically speaking, by Francis Fukuyama, 1991, 1996, The End of History and the Last Man Standing, the future belonging to liberal democracy. Well, that is not the case, certainly not right now, but which should give us the incentive to defend liberal democracy as the only real democracy regime in the world. But if we don't defend it, I'm sorry?
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, are we doing enough to defend it? We've got about 2 minutes left. I'd love to know whether we're doing enough on our supply chain defense to ensure that we're not being taken advantage of.
We are not doing it, and therefore careful re-examination of our relationship with China, reconfiguring the supply chains in a way that at least gradually move away from China. And when it comes to the last but not least, three suggestions: education to democracy, so that our children, our future, the young, are aware of how fortunate we are to be what, where, and how we are.
And are we doing enough in that area right now? Probably not.
No, not yet. Certainly not. And that is something that we should consider very carefully. Again, there is a lot that more that can be said about these, especially when it comes to elementary and secondary education. The universities are an environment, a realm all its own, which actually places us in the most problematic situation practically as we speak. And of course, if there is an opportunity in some future, we can deal with that in a more detailed manner.
We've got about 30 seconds left. Are you hopeful about the future despite all these challenges?
I'm always hopeful about our future. By the way, the first time our future was put in doubt was in 1918, when Oswald Spengler, a German historian, foresaw the end of Western democracies. Of course, he was completely wrong. That's why I'm very happy to reiterate the idea that if we do all we can, all that we must, of course we'll be winning. There's no question about that. But we have the commitment. We need the commitment, the leadership. Leadership is crucially important. Example, the last example.
We actually have time, no more time for your examples. I apologize for that, sir. It's
Yeah,
been a great
yeah.
session with you. I want to thank you, and we'll
I
obviously have to
thank
have
you
you
very
back
much.
again. Thank you
I
so much,
thank
sir.
you. I thank you so much.
Thank you to our guest, Dr. Jacob Kovalio, Professor, Department of History, Carleton University. A real interesting perspective on where our world is heading and some of the challenges ahead. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thanks for watching.